A black scientist just wanted to fly home with her daughter, but the moment she stepped into first class, a silent system decided she didn't belong, and just hours later, that decision cost the airline over $50 million. What happened on that flight shocked the world. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe stories like this need to be heard, subscribe and share. Because what happened next didn't just change a flight, it changed the industry. It was just an ordinary afternoon. The kind where people carry just enough fatigue on their shoulders to make a smile feel like a luxury. Raven Mitchell stood at gate A28, fingers wrapped gently around the handle of her daughter's pink carry-on suitcase. Her other hand rested over her own briefcase, a sleek black leather case that held nothing short of world-changing data. 15 months of research, compressed into a set of documents so critical they were hand-carried rather than trusted to any courier. Not because she didn't trust the mail. Because when you're a black woman in science, you learn early that the world loses things it doesn't understand. Ava, her 7-year-old daughter, leaned lightly against her leg, absorbed in a puzzle game on her tablet. The girl wore a button-down shirt tucked into navy trousers, hair braided into neat rows with soft lavender beads at the end that clicked gently when she moved. Raven glanced at her, then at the departure screen. Zurich, on time. She'd flown this route before. Skylux Airlines. Always on time, always clean. A metal door marked, authorized personnel only. The agent swiped a card, held it open. Private boarding, he smiled. VIP style. Raven stepped through. It didn't feel like a shortcut. It felt like an avoidance, a redirection. She didn't say that out loud. The metal staircase at the end led to the rear of the aircraft. Galley entrance. No line. No wait. No one to see who they were. Inside, the difference was immediate. Cold air. Cold stares. A flight attendant in a too-tight uniform glanced up as Raven entered, then pressed her radio with subtle fingers. Manin just boarded. Hippiat. Manogdi. Guest flagged as potential disturbance. Raven heard it. So did Ava. She didn't react. They walked forward. The first-class cabin greeted them not with warmth, but with silence. Ambient gold lighting, plush seats. But no one greeted her. No one offered towels. The white family in 1A received hot cloths. So did the business duo in 3B. Raven received nothing. No eye contact. No smile. Just the quiet hum of dismissal. She found their seats, 2A and 2C, separated by an aisle and indifference. The man in 2B sipped citrus water already settled. He didn't look at her. The young girl in 1A did, curious and confused. Her mother leaned in, whispered something that made the girl nod slowly and turn back around. Raven sat, placed Ava's tablet in her lap, folded her hands, waited. The drink cart came, skipped her row. The towel tray passed. Nothing. She wasn't invisible. She was being made invisible. No one told her the seat was in question. No one told her her ticket was being verified. But she saw the glances, the whispers. The words passed like data packets over a network of bias. A junior attendant, nervous, hovered near the galley with a tablet in hand, glancing at seat 2A, and then away again. Manifest check, she murmured to a colleague. Verify against updated compliance notes. Ava looked up at her mother. Mommy, is it supposed to be this cold? Raven reached for the blanket no one had offered. Ava had already pulled her knees into her chest. The meal came. Not the sea base Raven had selected. A cold plastic tray of unseasoned chicken. Better for your taste profile, the attendant said. My taste profile? Raven asked quietly. Yes. It's milder. More suitable. He did not look at her. Ava didn't touch her food. Neither did Raven. Instead, she removed a napkin from her briefcase, cleaned Ava's fingers gently, then returned to watching the window, where the tarmac shimmered like denial. The moment of rupture came disguised as turbulence. A man 2 rows ahead, already drunk, stumbled, wine glass in hand. The red liquid flew sideways. Splashed across Raven's cream trousers, Ava's tablet, her briefcase. Oh, the man said lazily. Should have stayed in your lane, sweetheart. No one moved. Not a single flight attendant offered her a towel. Not until Kayla, the youngest one. She came forward, eyes uncertain but filled with a quiet fury. She knelt down beside Ava. Let me help. Raven didn't cry. Ava didn't cry. But something broke then. Something in the silence. Kayla returned with a fresh towel, club soda, a gentle voice. This shouldn't have happened. Raven nodded once. That was all. Behind the curtain, Lisa hissed. She's flagged. You're on probation. Step back. Kayla's voice trembled. Flagged for what? Being here? Lisa's reply was cold. Submit your resignation when we land. Kayla said nothing. Just turned and continued cleaning. Back in seat 2A, Raven opened her briefcase. Pressed a button on her tablet. A locked file. One she hadn't needed to use. One that said execute contract termination, Skylux Logistics Partnership. She hadn't meant to open it, but now she did. The moment the file confirmed, 3 warehouses around the globe received alerts. Effective immediately, Skylux Airlines had lost their rights to ship Geniris Biopharma's sensitive medical payloads. $1.5 million annually. Just vanished. The silence in the cabin became heavier. And Raven Mitchell, scientist, mother, visionary, sat in seat 2A. Unbothered. Undeniable. What came next would change everything. The hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm as the aircraft reached cruising altitude. But inside seat 2A, Raven Mitchell's breath remained slow and deliberate, calibrated not by comfort but by necessity. Next to her, Ava had curled into a quiet ball, tablet now wiped clean but dimmed by the awkward residue of dried red wine. The scent still lingered faintly in the air, bittersweet, tannic, humiliating. It wasn't the stain that bothered Raven. It was the assumption beneath it. The way the man had looked at her like she was furniture in his aisle, an inconvenience to be stepped over, not a human being occupying a space she had paid for just like him. More than paid. Earned. The silence from the crew following the incident had been deafening. Not a single question about whether she or Ava was okay. Not a gesture of apology. Just procedural mutterings, cold stares, and a quiet reversion to their preferred narrative, that she did not exist. And yet, she did. Emphatically so. The intercom clicked to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are now cruising at 35,000 feet. Flight time remaining to Zurich is approximately 7 hours and 45 minutes. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the service. Service. Raven almost laughed. But she didn't. Because Ava was still awake, and she needed her mother to be steady. A few rows ahead, the drunk man had already dozed off, head tilted, mouth slack, empty glass still lodged in his tray table as if nothing had happened. His shirt remained half unbuttoned. His tie was a loose accusation of professionalism, but he snored like he owned the sky. Kayla hadn't returned since the confrontation with Lisa. Raven had seen the brief tension in her shoulders as she disappeared behind the galley curtain, and since then, a rotating cast of attendants resumed the rhythm of avoidance with more precision than before, each task delegated away from seat 2A like it was radioactive. A new face approached. Male, 40s, bald, with a supervisor badge clipped to his vest and a demeanor rehearsed for de-escalation. Ms. Mitchell, he asked, voice low, falsely warm. Mind if I speak with you for a moment? Raven looked at him. Of course, she said even. He crouched beside her seat, careful not to kneel. We understand there was a disturbance earlier involving another passenger. I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience and assure you we're addressing the situation. Inconvenience? She repeated, her voice calm. Yes, he continued, maintaining his smile. We're committed to ensuring all our passengers feel valued and respected. Are you? She asked. He blinked. I'm sorry. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. If a child had been treated the way mine was, excluded from an experience offered to others, told she wouldn't understand, handed second-rate food, denied warmth, then doused in wine by a drunk adult, what would your protocol say about that? His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. That wasn't an inconvenience, she continued. It was the predictable result of a culture that thinks politeness is a substitute for justice. He tried again, his voice a notch softer. We take these things seriously. We'll be filing a report. Is there anything we can do for you now? Raven looked down at Ava, then back at him. You can start by not filing it under disruption caused by the person who was harmed. He nodded. Of course. But his eyes flickered briefly toward his tablet, and Raven caught the hesitation. He wasn't here to fix anything. He was here to document compliance. Have a safe remainder of your flight, he said quickly, and then he stood and left. His clipboard never closed. The cabin lights dimmed. It was a long-haul international flight, and as the sky outside shifted from bright white clouds to a grayer dusk, the attendants began preparing the cabin for evening service. Tray tables lowered. Mood lighting warmed. Passengers received their second drinks, reclined seats, and in some cases, complimentary pajamas and slippers. Raven received nothing. Across the aisle, a woman 2 rows down was laughing softly at something on her screen. Her husband leaned over, snuggling under a plush navy blanket. They were offered a dessert course, tiny macarons plated with chocolate drizzle and edible flowers. Raven's tray table remained folded. Her meal tray from earlier still hadn't been cleared. A junior attendant finally arrived, eyes darting around nervously as she reached to remove the tray. As she leaned forward, a small slip of paper fluttered from her hand, dropped either by accident or subconscious rebellion. It landed beside Raven's foot. She picked it up. Internal use only. 2A prior complaints logged. Engage cautiously. Limit interaction unless guest initiates. Avoid escalation. Raven stared at the note. Prior complaints. There were none. She had never complained on a flight. Never raised her voice. Never even asked for an upgrade. But the note wasn't about history. It was about perception. A construct they had built around her. Her very presence had been flagged, not because of anything she had done, but because of who she was and where she dared to sit. She folded the note carefully, placed it into her briefcase next to the signed withdrawal agreement from earlier, and closed the latch with a soft click. Ava stirred. "Mommy," she whispered, "are we going to have to move seats?" Raven smoothed her daughter's curls gently. "No, sweetheart. We're staying right here." A few minutes later, movement in the aisle drew her attention. Kayla had returned. This time, she didn't approach Raven directly. Instead, she passed through the cabin quietly, stopping at other passengers' rows with polite gestures, offers of water or additional snacks. But as she walked past 2A, her hand dipped just slightly, letting a small object slide discreetly onto Raven's tray, an embossed envelope. No logo, just her name. Raven opened it beneath the tray's edge. Inside was a single handwritten line on hotel stationery. "They don't know who you are. But I do. Thank you for reminding me." Raven's lips parted slightly. Not a smile, but something warmer. Something real. The moment passed. Kayla moved on. Ava fell asleep at last, and Raven pulled the blanket around her. Outside the window, darkness stretched into infinity. Clouds layered like stacked pages unread. But somewhere far below, the world had already begun to read this story. Not just because of the wine or the meal or the whispered codes, but because someone in 3C had uploaded a video. A silent clip, time-stamped, capturing the way Raven had been skipped during meal service, the way her child had been turned away, the exact moment the wine hit her lap. The footage was raw, unnarrated, just truth, and it was spreading. Raven hadn't posted it. She didn't need to. Justice sometimes starts in silence, but it never stays there. As the cabin settled into soft snores and rustling linens, a new tension simmered. Not the old kind, forged in quiet cruelty, but something different. A reckoning. And this time it had altitude. At 35,000 feet, night cloaked the aircraft in artificial calm. The glow of overhead reading lights was sparse now, scattered like distant stars across the first-class cabin. Most passengers had retreated behind eye masks, reclined seats, and the illusion of comfort. But in seat 2A, Raven Mitchell remained fully awake, upright, alert. The serenity of her posture masked a storm quietly gathering beneath her skin. She hadn't moved in nearly an hour, save for the occasional check on Ava, whose breathing now matched the soft rhythm of sleep. But stillness didn't mean peace. Somewhere in the quiet cabin, the dynamics had begun to shift. At first, it was subtle. A murmur here, a sideways glance there. The unmistakable shift in energy that occurs when something hidden begins to surface. The video from row 3C had started making rounds faster than turbulence. A clipped moment, barely 90 seconds long, showing Raven sitting still as wine spilled across her lap. No reaction. No assistance. Just her quiet composure. The shot then panned, catching the smirk on the drunk man's face, and most damning of all, the blank indifference on the face of Lisa, the lead flight attendant, as she walked away. No outrage. No empathy. No protocol. Someone on the ground had recognized Raven almost instantly. Within minutes, headlines began populating. Renowned scientist humiliated in first class. RNA visionary mistaken for a threat. This woman designed a vaccine, and they asked her to prove she belonged. A journalist had picked it up. A medical blogger. Then a flight rights advocate. By the time Raven's seat was once again passed over for a final snack round, no chocolate, no fruit plate, not even a mint. The clip had crossed over 2 million views. She hadn't said a word. but the world had begun to scream on her behalf. The man in seat 2B, silent for most of the flight, was now clearly restless. He had taken to refreshing the feed on his phone in slow, guilty intervals, the glow of the screen illuminating his frown. At one point, he half turned toward Raven, seemed on the verge of speaking, then stopped himself. He pressed his call button instead, asking for a third drink. A woman across the aisle whispered to her partner, nudging her phone toward him. The man nodded stiffly, then put his phone face down on his tray. They didn't look back at Raven. But they didn't laugh anymore either. Back in the galley, the crew had gone quiet. The routine banter had stopped. Lisa was nowhere to be seen. Kayla moved in solemn circles, attending to requests with mechanical grace. When she reached Raven's row, she paused, not to speak, not to break protocol, but to quietly set down a bottle of chilled water and a folded note. Raven opened it. "They know now. I'm sorry it took this long." It wasn't much, but it was the first real apology all flight. As the news cycle accelerated, so did the unraveling. Raven's name trended alongside keywords like racial profiling, aviation ethics, silent discrimination. Articles dug into her background: Harvard alumna, biotech pioneer, recipient of multiple humanitarian awards. Her face, now framed against the soft gold of first class, was plastered across digital news tickers. And beside her name, always, was the airline's Skylux. Every tweet, every repost, every outraged comment, each one was a bead of pressure adding weight to the already cracking facade of corporate distance. It wasn't just about her anymore. She had become a mirror, and no one, especially not the powerful, liked what they saw in it. Somewhere near the cockpit, the captain had received a ping from corporate, a request to verify if Dr. Raven Mitchell was indeed on board. He didn't respond right away, not because he didn't know, but because the implications had suddenly grown teeth. In a private Slack channel reserved for senior flight crew, panic simmered. "What do we do?" "Do not approach her. Legal is handling it. Do not acknowledge any video or headline. Maintain standard protocol." But standard protocol was no longer protection. Not when silence looked like complicity. Not when complicity could cost millions. Meanwhile, back in seat 2A, Raven checked her tablet again. The internal alert system she had designed for her team back at Gen Iris was now active, monitoring mentions, cross-referencing statements, capturing public sentiment. A message popped up from her legal advisor. "You good? We're standing by. Say the word, and we launch." She typed back, "Not yet. Let the narrative breathe." A few rows behind her, a passenger raised his voice slightly, not in confrontation, but in inquiry. "Excuse me," he said to a nearby attendant, "is it true? That's Dr. Raven Mitchell, isn't it?" The attendant blinked, said nothing, then walked away. The man turned to his wife, whispering, "She was on that panel with the WHO last year. I watched her keynote on adaptive genomics. And they treated her like this?" The wife shook her head. "They're going to regret this." They already did. Back in the galley, Lisa had finally emerged, pale and tense. She made a beeline for the satellite phone mounted discreetly near the cockpit, punched in a code, and began speaking in hushed tones. "I was following internal directives," she said. "No," the voice on the other end replied. "You followed a bias protocol with a paper trail. That's liability now. I didn't write the protocol, but you enforced it." Lisa's face went still. She looked through the small porthole in the galley door and saw Raven sitting upright, the very image of unshaken poise, while the rest of the cabin buzzed with uncertainty. "She's just one woman," Lisa muttered. The voice snapped back. "She's a scientist on the ethics board of one of our logistics partners. And she just executed a termination clause. Do you know what that means for our valuation?" Lisa didn't respond. Because she did. Back in the cabin, the tension transformed. Where once there had been icy indifference, there was now fidgeting discomfort. Raven hadn't changed her posture, but everyone else had. Small gestures, people sitting up straighter, glancing in her direction with soft murmurs of recognition. No one knew what to say. So they said nothing. Again. But this time, it wasn't the silence of disregard. It was the silence of shame. Kayla returned again, this time with a tray of fresh fruit and a handwritten card that simply read, "For you and Ava. No conditions." She placed it gently beside Raven, who nodded once in return. The younger attendant didn't linger. She just turned and walked away, back rigid but purposeful. 30 minutes later, the flight crew received their final alert. Legal action was probable. Containment was no longer an option. The CEO of Skylux was informed in the middle of a global investment meeting. His assistant whispered something into his ear, and his expression changed instantly. He excused himself with forced calm, unaware that cameras were still rolling as he left the stage. It was already too late. Back on the plane, Raven finally reclined her seat slightly, exhaled, and allowed her eyes to close for the first time in hours. Not in surrender, but in arrival. Because even though the aircraft wouldn't land for another 5 hours, her impact already had. And the altitude had never felt more earned. Sleep never really found her, not in the true, deep way it did for others on the flight. But sometime around hour 5 of the transatlantic journey, Raven Mitchell allowed herself to close her eyes, not to rest, but to recalibrate. The kind of stillness she practiced wasn't a retreat, it was a weapon. A pause before the next move. Around her, the cabin swam in quiet, insulated by the hum of altitude and the artificial calm of dimmed lights and scented air. But beneath the cabin's surface, something new pulsed. Tension, not from exclusion, but from recognition. When she opened her eyes again, it wasn't to the sound of Ava's soft breathing beside her, or the rustle of a refreshed drinks cart, but to the faint vibration of her tablet. A new message. Discreet. From her logistics council. All 3 distribution hubs have acknowledged receipt. Termination clause successfully executed. Skylux formally delisted from preferred transport vendor register. Raven didn't smile. There was nothing to celebrate yet. But she did allow herself one breath, slow, deep, controlled. A breath that tasted of accountability. Even at 35,000 feet. Across the aisle, the businessman in Tubi looked more uncomfortable than before. His shoes were off, but he'd abandoned any attempt at relaxation. He'd begun scrolling furiously on his phone, and every so often, Raven noticed the subtle flick of his eyes, glancing at her, then away, like someone bracing for a conversation they no longer felt qualified to start. The cabin around her had shifted from willful blindness to simmering curiosity. But she wasn't interested in curious stares. She was watching something else entirely. Kayla, the junior flight attendant, whose quiet acts of defiance had been the only flickers of human warmth on the entire flight, now moved with visible weight in her steps. Her eyes were red, either from exhaustion or a private confrontation behind the curtain. Likely both. Her uniform still impeccable, her posture still straight, but something about the way her hand lingered just a moment too long on each tray, each touch point, gave her away. She wasn't just working anymore. She was grieving something. It wasn't until Kayla passed Raven's row again that their eyes met, truly met, not in secret or code but directly. Raven didn't need to say anything. The look they exchanged was more than gratitude. It was a pact. And Kayla kept walking. Moments later, Lisa returned to the cabin. Her presence snapped through the atmosphere like static. Her hair was still perfect, her blouse still pressed, but the mask of composed professionalism was cracking. Tiny fissures had begun to show in her expression, too controlled, too aware. She walked quickly to a passenger in 1A and leaned down. "Mr. Templeton," she whispered with a strained smile, "would you mind following me to the front galley for a brief moment? Captain has a message to relay." He looked confused but nodded, rising and following her through the curtain. It was a bluff. There was no message. There was, however, a decision being discussed, one Lisa was hoping to influence. She had already contacted corporate via secure channels and was told, in no uncertain terms, that any further escalation involving Raven Mitchell would result in immediate liability exposure. But Lisa wasn't used to being told what to do. She was used to managing people, situations, perceptions. And this time, perception was spiraling far beyond her grasp. The drunk passenger had sobered up partially, enough to realize that something had gone wrong. He hadn't moved from his seat, but now he sat stiffly, glancing at his own reflection in the window, as if looking for a version of himself he could believe wasn't complicit. Raven, meanwhile, opened a different folder on her tablet. It was something she'd prepared long before this flight, what her legal team jokingly referred to as her just-in-case doctrine. A pre-drafted statement, a press release, and a personal message to her foundation and staff in case of public crisis. She had never thought she'd have to use it. Now she was editing the final paragraph. As she typed, the in-flight system chimed again, this time offering premium entertainment options. A tone-deaf announcement, but one Raven ignored. Instead, she glanced down at Ava, still asleep but shifting slightly, murmuring in her dreams. Then came the buzz. Not from her device this time, but a wave that rolled down the aisle like pressure before a storm. A man in 3C, a journalist, though few on board knew it yet, stood and turned slowly toward the aisle, holding his phone in one hand, screen facing outward. On it, a still frame, Raven Mitchell, standing beside the CEO of Gen Iris, her arm raised as she held the prototype vial of their RNA vaccine. The headline above her image read, "Scientist. Visionary. Mother. Target." Whispers swept through the rows. "That's her. She's the one from the vaccine panel. Oh my God, I saw her TED Talk last year. How could they treat her like that?" Phones came alive like fireflies, faces suddenly lit with the glow of realization. A woman in 3B opened her email app and began drafting what looked suspiciously like a formal complaint. The couple in 1C sat stiffly, their eyes darting nervously toward the front galley. Raven felt the temperature shift, not in degrees but in power. She wasn't being ignored anymore. She was being feared. But that fear wasn't hers. Kayla reemerged, holding a silver tray with a single item, a handwritten apology note embossed with the airline's logo, clearly drafted in haste. She stopped at Raven's row. "Ma'am," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "This is from our executive liaison team." "I was instructed to." Raven raised a hand. "Did you write it?" Kayla hesitated. "No, ma'am." "Then I don't need it." The tray lowered. Slowly. Kayla bowed her head slightly and retreated. Across the aisle, the businessman finally spoke. "Dr. Mitchell," he began, his voice thin. I didn't realize." She didn't look at him. "You did," she said quietly. "You just didn't care until the world did." He fell silent. The curtain at the front of the cabin opened suddenly. Lisa stood there, pale, lips pursed. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "due to unforeseen turbulence ahead, we'll be suspending all beverage service for the remainder of the flight. Please remain in your seats with seatbelts fastened." It was a lie, a retreat disguised as procedure. No one bought it, especially not Raven, because she had felt real turbulence before, and it didn't sound like panic behind a curtain. The rest of the flight passed in fractured silence. Some passengers dozed, though fitfully. Others remained glued to their devices, refreshing headlines, watching the numbers rise. By the time the aircraft began its descent, the original video had reached 9 million views. Raven's name was now trending in multiple countries. A secondary video, taken by a flight attendant sympathetic to Kayla, had leaked the internal note labeling Raven as difficult, engage only when necessary. That note had been screenshotted over 200,000 times. As the plane touched down, wheels meeting tarmac with a jolt sharper than necessary, Raven didn't brace. She sat still, eyes forward. Around her, people began to stir, stretch, fumble with seatbelts. But no one made eye contact. Not yet. Not until they passed her row, one by one, on the way out, some nodding awkwardly, some offering barely audible apologies. None of it mattered. At the gate, security stood waiting. But not for her. For Lisa. And for once, Raven didn't have to say a word. The reckoning had already begun. The moment the aircraft door opened, the cabin filled with a strange, anticipatory silence. Not the usual hush of passengers fumbling for bags or exchanging tight smiles, but something heavier. Something charged. The energy shifted like the air before lightning strikes. The smell of pressurized air mixed with sterile jet bridge oxygen wafted in, but no one moved. Not immediately. Not until the announcement. Passengers in rows 1 through May 3rd now deplane. Raven didn't reach for her briefcase right away. She sat still waiting. Not because she wasn't ready, but because she understood something that the others were only beginning to realize. The world outside that door had changed in the time it took them to cross the Atlantic. And now it was waiting for her. Across the aisle, a man who had barely acknowledged her for the duration of the flight now rose too quickly, his hand trembling slightly as he pulled his roller bag from the overhead. He glanced at her, this time not with indifference, but with something more layered, guilt, regret, fear. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, his voice low, uncertain. I didn't know." She didn't even look up. "You didn't care to." And just like that, the weight of those 7 words dropped between them like stone. He nodded, ashamed, and walked away. One by one, the others followed. Passengers who had once turned their faces to ignore her now walked past her row with stiff shoulders and pressed lips. Some avoided her gaze entirely. Others lingered just long enough to whisper apologies that she didn't acknowledge. A few nodded as if in solidarity, but it was too late for that now. Kayla was standing by the forward galley, clipboard in hand, face composed but pale. When Raven reached the front, she paused. Kayla didn't smile. She didn't try to explain. But she did whisper, I submitted my resignation. They said I broke protocol. I told them I followed the only one that mattered. Raven met her eyes. You didn't break anything. You helped crack the silence. A brief nod passed between them. Then Raven walked off the plane. The jet bridge was empty, eerily so. No ground staff with chipper greetings. No waiting crowds. Just a single woman in a tailored slate gray pantsuit holding a sleek digital tablet and wearing a discreet earpiece. Dr. Mitchell? She asked, stepping forward with a practiced calm. I'm here to escort you and your daughter. This way, please. Raven gestured for Ava, who had been trailing close behind, still sleepy but alert, sensing that something significant was unfolding. They followed the woman down an alternate corridor, bypassing the bustling terminal. No press at this gate, the woman explained. Per your team's instructions. Security detail is stationed near your car. Legal is standing by. And your communications team has already drafted a response strategy. Everything's been cleared. Not yet, Raven replied softly. Ma'am, let the silence breathe a little longer. Let them sit in it. The woman blinked, but said nothing. She simply nodded and opened the final glass door leading to a waiting black sedan. No logos. No lights. Just stillness. Raven stepped inside. Ava followed. The doors shut, muffling the world. As the car pulled away, Ava leaned against her mother's side. Are people mad at you? She asked, voice small. No, Raven said, stroking her daughter's hair. They're mad at what was done to us. And at themselves, for not seeing it sooner. Will it stop now? No, Raven answered honestly. But it won't be silent anymore. As they drove, her phone buzzed again. This time, a notification not from media, but from Jairus' secure internal channel. Subject, emergency termination confirmed. All Skylux freight accounts locked. 3 major hospital networks have followed suit. Total loss, $48 million and rising. Do you wish to authorize public confirmation? Raven stared at the screen, then pressed one button. Yes. And just like that, the quiet collapse became an audible one. Within 20 minutes, Skylux's stock began to tumble. Analysts flagged the loss of Jairus as a catastrophic fracture in the company's credibility. Travel forums buzzed with boycotts. Corporate Twitter erupted. But none of it compared to what came next. Because someone had leaked the Slack threads. Internal messages. Documents that showed, without ambiguity, that Raven Mitchell had been flagged in their passenger system before the flight even departed. That she'd been listed as monitor for passive defiance, and a code, HIP-IA, had been added beside her name. High-impact passenger profile identity assessment. It was a code developed under the guise of safety and compliance, meant to alert crew members when a passenger deviated from the norm. But in practice, it had been used disproportionately against people of color, especially those in premium cabins. The leak showed rows of cases, patterns, discrimination masquerading as procedure. And now it was all public. The backlash was immediate. News channels interrupted broadcasts with breaking reports. Social media burned with hashtags. Hashtag her seat was earned, hashtag HE code exposed, hashtag she designed the cure. Even celebrities joined the conversation, posting photos with Raven's quote from a panel years ago. Dignity doesn't come from power. It comes from being seen. A group of university students staged a sit-in at Skylux's JFK terminal, holding up signs that read, "We won't let patients fly with prejudice." Hospitals announced contract terminations live on air. A prominent black doctor at a major children's hospital gave a televised interview stating, "If this can happen to Raven Mitchell, what's been happening to the rest of us for decades without cameras rolling?" Meanwhile, Raven sat quietly in the sedan, holding Ava's hand. She didn't check the headlines. She didn't need to, because the ripple she had started was no longer hers alone. It was being carried by others now. By people who had once watched and stayed quiet, now rising to their feet. By former employees of Skylux who came forward with testimony. By passengers sharing stories they had once buried. The reckoning had momentum. And somewhere in an undisclosed location, the Skylux boardroom had erupted in chaos. The CEO, Alan Hartley, sat under a spotlight of digital fury, sweating through his third emergency Zoom call in 12 hours. He tried to blame a rogue crew. Then miscommunication. Then a cultural misunderstanding. But the evidence was too clear. The board voted 11-0. He was out. By nightfall, so were the vice president of in-flight operations, the director of guest experience, and the head of risk. 6 executives. Gone. And it hadn't even been 24 hours since Raven's flight landed. But the most unexpected twist came quietly. No press release. No camera crews. Just a letter. Handwritten. Sent by mail. No return address. No logo. Just a plain envelope addressed, Dr. Raven Mitchell Geniris Foundation, private and confidential inside. Shaky handwriting read, I was the operations supervisor behind the boarding assignment that day. I followed the code. I authorized your reroute. I told myself I was just following rules. But my daughter is alive today because of the vaccine you helped build. I knew your name. I just didn't recognize your face. I see it now. I'm sorry. James Raven sat with the letter for a long time. She didn't cry, but her hands trembled slightly when she folded it, placed it in her archive folder. Not for legal reasons, but because some truths deserved to be preserved. She didn't write back, but she didn't need to. Because weeks later, during her foundation's annual ethics symposium, she saw him. Not on stage. Not in a suit. He was volunteering at the check-in desk. Quiet. Steady. Answering questions, handing out name tags. He didn't approach her. But when she passed him, she paused. You gave me silence when I needed a voice, she said. But today you chose to show up. That matters. He nodded, tears welling, unable to speak. And in that moment something shifted, not in power but in understanding. The kind that reshapes everything it touches. Just like she had. The 6th week after the incident unfolded, not in a burst, but in quiet reconstruction. The world had already erupted in the aftermath of Raven Mitchell's flight. Firings, divestments, protests, think pieces, but real change never arrives as fireworks. It creeps in through policy drafts, whispered meetings, second chances, and long overdue acknowledgments. And Raven, true to form, remained at the center of the storm, not as a symbol, but as a surgeon, steady hands, sharp mind, cutting into the root of the rot. She didn't fade away after the headlines slowed. She didn't retreat into comfort or rest on vindication. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves. The day she returned to Geniris headquarters, the entire building had gone silent upon her arrival. Not because they feared her, but because they knew what she represented now, a reckoning that had finally reached their own doorstep. And with that reckoning came responsibility. At her first internal meeting, Raven didn't speak about the flight at all. She opened instead with a single slide. Systems protect what they're designed to recognize. Let's redesign recognition. It was a declaration, not of vengeance, but of blueprint. From there, she outlined a new initiative, Project C3, Compliance, Compassion, Change. The objective was as ambitious as it was necessary, to identify, dismantle, and rebuild every internal protocol Geniris had that could unconsciously exclude or silence those who didn't look like their executives. She wasn't just auditing Skylux. She was auditing everyone. And they listened. Because the woman who had once been quietly rerouted through a service entrance was now the voice defining service for the next decade. Meanwhile, Skylux's new interim leadership team, composed entirely of individuals brought in through third-party ethics boards, reached out to Raven not with press statements, but with humility. The proposal arrived in a sealed envelope, hand-delivered to her office. It contained 3 pages, a formal apology, signed by every member of the newly installed board, a proposed partnership offer, asking Raven to serve as honorary advisor on human dignity and service ethics. A blank check, metaphorically and literally, to redesign their internal training, passenger service protocols, and feedback systems from the ground up. Her team was skeptical. They want you to fix the system that failed you, one colleague said. No, Raven replied. They want to survive. I want to change. If we turn them away, we change nothing. So she accepted, on one condition. Every flight crew member, from captains to gate agents, would be required to attend immersive workshops led not by corporate trainers, but by those who had been historically excluded, people of color, people with disabilities, people profiled mid-flight, deported mid-transit, dehumanized in aisles with $1,000 seats. And those stories, those lived truths, would be the curriculum. To their credit, Skylux agreed. They didn't just agree. They funded the initiative with a $15 million restructuring grant and made attendance tied to performance reviews and promotions. And it began. The workshops didn't start in pristine conference halls. Raven made sure of that. The first session took place in a repurposed hangar, with rows of folding chairs, fluorescent lighting, and no podium. Because if people were going to understand the roots of dignity, They needed to be stripped of the illusions that titles and uniforms created. Kayla was there, no longer a junior flight attendant. She had been offered her job back, but she declined. Instead, she took a position on Raven's training team. Her first session opened with a simple story, hers. How she saw the pattern but stayed quiet, until she couldn't anymore, and how that moment of choice cost her everything, and gave her everything else in return. The room didn't applaud. They didn't need to. They listened. The weeks turned into months, and Raven, ever deliberate, watched how quickly change could either root or retreat. Some resisted. Some merely performed compliance. But others, more than expected, opened. One captain, grizzled and near retirement, approached her after a session. "I used to think treating people equally meant treating them the same," he said. "You made me realize dignity isn't one size fits all. It's recognizing who someone is before deciding what they deserve." Another crew member asked if she could read Ava a story during a break, the one your daughter was reading when the wine was spilled. Raven smiled and handed over the tablet. Ava, who had quietly become a fixture during these sessions, handed it over with trust. Small things, but not small gestures. The internal language at Skylux began to change. Codes like HIP-IA were purged. Passenger flags were replaced with situational context alerts that required human review, not algorithmic assumptions. Every complaint was re-examined. Every silence revisited. But the true test came quietly, exactly 1 year later. A new Skylux aircraft stood ready at the gate. New livery, new leadership, and a new manifest system designed from scratch. Same destination, Zurich. Same seat, 2A. Raven stood at the boarding gate, Ava's hand in hers once more. But this time, there was no sideways glance. No rear out. No faux smile concealing a redirection. Just a gate agent who scanned her boarding pass, smiled sincerely, and said, "Welcome aboard, Dr. Mitchell. We're honored to have you." As they stepped through the main entry, not the service entrance, Raven felt something she hadn't felt in that space for a long time: ease. The crew greeted her by name. The cabin was warm, not just in temperature but in tone. And when Ava asked if she could see the cockpit, the captain himself came to the front of the plane, knelt down to her eye level, and said, quietly trying to say, "We've changed." And in many ways they had. But change was never permanent without resistance. She understood this, which was why she kept showing up. Across the aisle, Ava sat upright, not just as a passenger, but as a quiet witness to her mother's legacy. She was older now, not in years so much as in gaze. She had seen things most children were protected from. And still she smiled. Still she believed. That was the miracle Raven had fought hardest to preserve. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with precision. Not robotic, not scripted, trained. Human. The kind of professionalism that comes not from fear of being recorded, but from understanding why someone might record in the first place. Respect had become part of the design. The man seated in 2B this time was a young South Asian entrepreneur, judging by the pitched deck he was scrolling through on his tablet. He smiled politely when Raven took her seat, offered to help with her bag, and when she declined, didn't insist. It was a small thing, but small things had always been the beginning of something larger. Mid-flight, a soft chime rang as the in-flight messaging app lit up on Raven's screen. A new message, internal, from the Skylux board liaison. Subject, first full quarter under reform status. Operational impact exceeding projections. Passenger satisfaction in first-class service rose 21%. Internal bias violations decreased by 47%. Staff turnover dropped. Training program led by your team cited as key driver. Would you consider addressing the board in person next quarter? She read it twice, then closed it without replying. Not because she didn't care, but because the answer was already in her presence. She had addressed the board every day she kept showing up. She didn't need another podium. She needed consistency. Around hour 3 of the flight, a passenger several rows back began to panic, first in whispers, then in erratic gestures. A young black man, clearly nervous, breathing too fast, scanning the cabin. He wasn't loud. He wasn't violent. He was afraid. It was obvious. Years ago, the crew might have whispered into radios, escalated quickly, called security midair. But not today. A flight attendant approached with calm, knelt by the man, and asked, "Do you need space or someone to sit with you?" He couldn't answer. He was shaking. "I'm going to stay right here," she said gently, sitting in the empty seat beside him, just out of reach but close enough to be real. "Just breathe. I'm not going anywhere." The man eventually nodded. He calmed. No codes were called. No eyes rolled. No glances of suspicion passed around the cabin. Just quiet understanding. Training at work. Raven watched from her seat. That moment, unscripted, unrecorded, was the proof she hadn't known she needed. Later, after the incident had resolved, the attendant passed by Raven's row. Their eyes met, and Raven said quietly, "That was exactly right." The attendant smiled. "Learned it from the module you built." And there it was again, the ripple. The rest of the flight passed peacefully. No incidents. No headlines. But when the wheels touched down in Zurich, something waited on the tarmac that Raven hadn't expected. A small group of international aviation representatives stood in formation, not with fanfare, but with solemnity. Among them was the director of the Global Air Passenger Equity Alliance, a woman who had once marched through terminals holding signs that read "Passengers are not profiles." Now she held a folder. Inside it, a formal invitation for Raven to co-author the International Bill of Air Travel Dignity Protocols to be adopted by carriers across Europe and parts of Asia. Raven accepted the folder. "We want your language," the director said. "Not just your name." "I'll give you both," Raven answered. Back in the terminal, Ava clutched her mother's hand, looking around at the sea of travelers. She pointed to the overhead screen showing news coverage in the corner. "Global policy reform in aviation gains momentum. Mitchell's legacy expands." Raven chuckled softly. "They make it sound like I've retired." "You kind of did, right?" Ava said, teasing. "From flying coach." They both laughed. But the truth was, Raven hadn't retired from anything. She'd simply moved to a different altitude of work. She spent the following weeks in Zurich not at galas or press tours, but in conference rooms. Whiteboards, translators, policy analysts all gathered around as she deconstructed the language of compliance to rebuild it with humanity. What does threat mean when divorced from stereotype? What does security look like when defined by inclusion? What does VIP service mean when every human deserves dignity? She asked hard questions, pushed harder answers, and slowly they rewrote the language of an industry. But back home, something else stirred. Gen Iris had launched its ethics fellowship in her name. Young scientists, many of them from backgrounds like hers, were now applying to work in labs where they weren't just seen as interns, but as inheritors. One applicant wrote in her essay, "I didn't know someone who looked like me could be a principal investigator until I saw Dr. Mitchell on the news, wearing red wine like armor." Raven kept that line. It reminded her that the story never belonged to her alone. In one of the final training sessions of that year, Kayla stood at the front of a small group of new recruits. She wore no name tag. She didn't need one anymore. "When I pressed that towel into her lap," she told them, "I wasn't saving her. I was saving myself. I was remembering who I wanted to be in a room full of silence." In the back of the room, Raven sat unnoticed until the end. She clapped quietly. Kayla saw her. And for the first time in a long time, she wept. But not from shame. From clarity. The chapter that had begun in the cold silence of a transatlantic flight had reached a place of warmth, not finality. Not closure, but continuity. Because the skies were not yet just. But they were changing. And so long as Raven Mitchell was alive to board another plane, so was the hope that dignity could fly with you. Seatbelt fastened, tray table up, and respect included, every single time. The morning sunlight spilled across the tarmac like a quiet triumph, golden and precise, casting elongated shadows from the wheels of a Skylux aircraft that had just taxied into Gate 18. It was exactly 1 year, down to the hour, since Raven Mitchell and her daughter Ava had disembarked from a flight that shattered more than silence. Now the same airport bore no resemblance to the sterile hallways they once walked through unnoticed, unwelcomed. The terminal was different. Not because of banners or headlines, but because of the people. Agents no longer stood stiffly behind desks, scanning passengers like potential disruptions. They greeted with intention, not habit. Uniforms remained pressed, but their wearers no longer used them like armor. Something deeper had shifted, not in policies alone, but in posture. And at the center of that quiet shift stood Raven Mitchell. She wasn't there for a flight this time. No agenda, no press circuit, no protest. She was there to watch, to listen, to witness whether the change she had fought for had survived without her constant touch. Whether dignity, when institutionalized, could become muscle memory. She and Ava stood behind the tinted glass near the arrivals gate, watching as passengers from the new Skylux Zurich flight disembarked. Some looked tired. Some laughed. Others simply moved, unaware they were walking into a story that had been edited, line by line, in their favor. They would never know they were once considered data points in a flawed algorithm, that they were once profile codes instead of people. But Raven knew, and in her pocket was a letter she hadn't yet decided to deliver. It was from the newly elected chairperson of the International Aviation Ethics Consortium. The letter offered Raven the opportunity to lead the first Global Passenger Dignity Council, a body designed to oversee international flight standards for ethics, profiling protections, and passenger advocacy. The council would have real teeth, veto power over proposed airline practices, review authority over complaint data, and budget access to audit compliance across borders. It was an offer that would change the rest of her life. Again, but it wasn't why she came here today. This visit was personal. She looked over at Ava, who stood in a soft blue blazer, her school's Model UN delegate pin proudly displayed on her lapel. At 12, Ava had already become more articulate than most grown men in boardrooms. She'd presented at 2 middle school policy summits and led her own campaign on youth privacy rights in technology. And now, she stood quietly, watching passengers exit the plane, her eyes fixed, searching. "He's there," she said suddenly, pointing with a confident certainty only she could carry. "Third from the front. The one with the beard and the orange tie." Raven squinted. "That's him." Ava nodded. "James. He's the one, right?" Raven gave a slow smile. "Yes. He's the one. James, once the operations supervisor who had quietly approved Raven's reroute down a service hallway. Once the man whose silence had cost a corporation everything, now wore a Skylux badge with the words Dignity Officer printed just below his name. He hadn't been hired back into power. He had asked to work from the ground up. And today, he stood near the arrivals arch, handing out pamphlets to incoming passengers. Not about upgrades, not about lounge benefits, but about their rights. Clear, concise, written in plain language. James handed the pamphlets with eye contact, not sales pitch. With quiet humility, not performance. And every few passengers, one paused to read. One smiled. One asked a question. And James answered, not with the defensiveness of someone trying to avoid lawsuits, but with the care of someone who finally understood the weight of his job. "He stayed," Ava whispered. "He chose to," Raven replied. "And that matters more than most people realize." They stepped away from the viewing glass and headed for a different terminal. Not to fly, but to speak. Today marked the unveiling of Skylux's new flagship training center, the Mitchell Center for Human Dignity in Flight. It wasn't Raven's idea. She had opposed the naming at first. "It's not about me," she'd said. But the board insisted. So did Kayla. "Names are anchors," Kayla had told her. "Yours tells them where the change began." Now Kayla stood at the podium in a white linen blazer, her voice amplified across a courtyard packed with media, staff, and new recruits. She was no longer just an attendant. She was now Skylux's Senior Director of Ethical Experience, a title Raven still found deeply satisfying. "Some people measure change in statements or settlements," Kayla said into the mic, "but I measure it in stories. The stories our passengers tell when they leave the aircraft. And we weren't writing good stories until someone demanded we rewrite the script." She paused, looked out over the crowd, found Raven. Dr. Raven Mitchell didn't just earn her seat. She gave us all a better cabin to sit in. Applause thundered through the space. Raven stood only because Ava tugged at her sleeve. "They're clapping for you," she said, as if it were obvious. "I know," Raven murmured, "but I'm clapping for them." Later, inside the center, Raven walked past interactive exhibits and training simulators. There was a virtual reality room that let new crew members experience flights from the perspective of passengers flagged by old profiling systems. There were recordings, testimonies from real travelers anonymously preserved, telling of cold meals, ignored calls, and silent removals. And there was one final display. It was simple, a seat, numbered 2A. Not the original one, of course, but a replica, down to the worn stitching and the faint wine stain immortalized into the armrest fabric. Above it, etched into the wall in brushed aluminum, "You cannot unseat dignity once it's earned." RM. As Raven stood before it, a group of young trainees filed in. One of them, a young woman with thick curly hair pulled into a high bun, gasped quietly when she recognized her. "Are you?" Raven nodded. The trainee looked at the seat, then back at her. "I'm not here because I wanted a job," she said. "I'm here because I watched your story when I was 15. It made me think, what if I could be the person who changed someone's flight?" Raven didn't smile. Not quite, but her eyes did. You already are, she said. Outside, as the sun began to set, the letter from the International Aviation Ethics Consortium remained folded in Raven's purse. She hadn't decided yet whether to accept the position. Not because she didn't want to help, but because she knew that her presence alone had already planted more seeds than a title ever could. Sometimes the most powerful leadership came not from the top, but from the aisle. From the moment someone chose to kneel beside a frightened passenger instead of labeling them. From the decision to place a towel gently instead of looking the other way. From the silence that turned into a story, and the story that turned into a system reset. Raven and Ava walked back toward the exit, passing a group of staff in Skylux uniforms laughing together. One of them noticed her and quickly straightened his posture, then stopped himself and waved casually like an equal. That was new. And that was everything. As they reached the door, Ava paused and asked, "So was it worth it?" Raven turned, the golden hour light catching in her eyes. "They took my comfort," she said. "They tried to take my place. But they gave me something bigger in return." "What's that?" Raven opened the door and stepped into the sun. A cabin where everyone belongs, and a sky that finally listens. And with that, they walked forward, into whatever came next.